The sun was sinking slowly, painting the sky with soft orange and gold. The air carried the smell of dust and pine. A cowboy rode alone on his tired horse, his hat tilted low, his clothes carrying the marks of a long journey. He wasn't heading anywhere in particular, only trying to get away from everything that had happened behind him. His name was Ethan, but that didn't matter to the world anymore. He was just another man trying to survive the wild. His horse moved at a slow pace. The land was quiet except for the sound of crickets and the whispering wind moving through dry grass. He had been riding for hours without rest. The water in his flask was almost gone. His arm ached from a cut he had gotten earlier, but he pushed on. He was used to pain, used to silence, used to being alone. But this evening something was different. The silence felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan pulled the reins gently and stopped near a ridge. His horse lifted its ears, alert. Down below, near a small stream hidden between trees, he saw movement. At first he thought it was a wild animal, but as he leaned forward he saw a woman. She was kneeling by the water, her long black hair falling over her shoulders. She moved with quiet grace, her hands working with plants and herbs she had gathered from the land. She wore simple clothes made of soft brown leather. Around her neck hung a small necklace carved from bone and beads. She was Apache, and she belonged to this land in a way he never could. Ethan hesitated. He didn't want to disturb anyone. But before he could pull away, a sharp pain shot through his arm. The cut had worsened. He tried to steady himself in the saddle, but his vision blurred. His hand slipped and he lost control. The next thing he knew, he was falling off his horse. He hit the ground with a hard thud, dust rising around him. The sound startled the woman. She turned quickly, her eyes sharp and focused. She saw the stranger on the ground, struggling to breathe, blood soaking through the fabric on his arm. For a moment she stayed still. A stranger in Apache land could be a danger, but then she saw his pale face, the way his hand trembled as he pressed it against the wound. He was weak, too weak to harm anyone. She didn't know who he was, but she could see he wouldn't last long without help. Her heart raced, but she walked toward him carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. Ethan blinked up at her. His sight was fading, but he could make out the shape of her face, strong, calm, and determined. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, and every breath felt like fire. She knelt beside him without a word. The air smelled of earth and river water. She pulled out a leather pouch tied at her waist and opened it with steady hands. Inside were herbs she had collected earlier, plants that her grandmother had taught her to use to stop bleeding and clean wounds. She didn't know this man's story. She didn't need to. What she saw was a life hanging by a thread. Ethan tried to lift his head, but she gently pressed her hand on his shoulder, silently telling him to stay down. He felt the warmth of her touch and, for the first time in many years, trusted a stranger. She quickly looked around to make sure no one else was near. She didn't want to be seen helping a white man. It could bring trouble, but she couldn't turn away either. With effort, she dragged him slowly to the shade of a tall tree near the stream. She wasn't strong, but determination gave her strength. His boots scraped the ground, his breath coming out in weak gasps. She propped him up against the trunk and checked the wound on his arm. It was bad, not just a cut. The bleeding came from deeper inside. She couldn't tell how the bullet had gotten there, but she knew she had to stop the bleeding before the night grew cold. The wind brushed against the trees and the first stars began to appear above. She soaked a cloth in river water and pressed it firmly against the wound. Ethan flinched, but she whispered softly in her language, words meant to calm. He didn't understand a single word, but the sound of her voice was soft like wind through leaves. He relaxed slightly, letting her work. The woman's hands were quick but gentle. She had done this before, not for strangers, but for her people, hunters, brothers, elders. She boiled some herbs in a small pot over a tiny fire, their scent filling the air with a clean, sharp smell. She tore a strip of deerskin from her satchel to use as a bandage. Ethan's vision came and went in waves. He could see the night sky above, the soft glow of the fire near her knees, and her face lit by the warm light. She didn't speak to him. She didn't ask questions. She just worked, quiet and focused. To him, it felt like watching someone who belonged to another world entirely, a world that was calm, steady, and full of quiet strength. A soft groan escaped his lips as she tightened the cloth around his arm to slow the bleeding. She didn't pull away. She pressed harder, whispering again, her tone steady. Sweat rolled down her temple, but she didn't stop. Her fingers were stained with his blood, but her eyes stayed strong. She had seen worse. Life on this land had taught her to be brave when no one else could. She made a small poultice from the crushed herbs and carefully placed it over the wound. Ethan winced but stayed still. He knew, even in his half-conscious state, that she was saving his life. A stranger, an Apache woman, could have left him to die, but she didn't. She chose to help. The firelight flickered, throwing soft shadows across their faces. His breathing grew slower, more steady. She checked his pulse with quiet hands, listening to the faint rhythm of life inside him. Her people believed that every soul who crossed their path did so for a reason. She didn't know why this man had crossed hers. She didn't know why she hadn't turned away, but something deep inside her told her to stay. She sat beside him through the night, feeding the small fire and changing the cloth on his wound when it grew too wet. His horse grazed nearby, calm now, as if it understood that its rider was safe. Crickets sang softly in the dark. The stars stretched like a blanket over the sky. Ethan's eyes opened once in the middle of the night. The pain was still there, but softer now. He saw her sitting near the fire, wrapping fresh herbs in cloth. Her face was calm, her posture straight. She looked like someone carved out of the land itself, strong and unshakable. Their eyes met for a brief second. He wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. She simply nodded as if to say, "Rest, you're safe here." He drifted back into sleep, the sound of the river and fire wrapping around him like a warm blanket. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. The woman sat there until the first light of dawn touched the tops of the trees. She had not planned this. She had not asked for this stranger. But now he was a part of her night, a story written in silence beside a stream. She looked at his face as the sunlight touched it, not knowing that this moment, this choice to help, would change both their lives forever. Ethan's chest rose and fell softly. His arm was bandaged, the bleeding finally stopped. He was alive because she chose to stay. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his past. But she had saved his life with nothing more than courage, herbs, and quiet strength. And somewhere in the back of her heart she knew that when you save a life under the open sky, a bond is made, even if no words are spoken. She stood slowly, walked to the stream, and washed the blood from her hands. The river carried it away, leaving only the soft sound of water. She glanced back at the cowboy still sleeping under the tree. The sun was rising. A new day had begun. Neither of them knew what would come next. But the land had a way of weaving people's paths together in unexpected ways. And their story, born out of a single night of quiet courage, and had only just begun. The night had grown colder, but the fire still burned softly beside the stream. The air smelled of pine, earth, and the faint scent of herbs. Ethan lay under the tall tree, his arm wrapped carefully in deerskin. The Apache woman, quiet and watchful, sat on a rock a few steps away, feeding the fire with small sticks. Her eyes stayed on the stranger. She didn't trust him, not yet. But she couldn't turn away either. She had chosen to help him, and now his life was tied to her care. His breathing was uneven at first. Each breath sounded like it came from far away, like he was fighting to stay in this world. She leaned closer and placed a warm cloth on his forehead. His skin burned with fever. She whispered a soft prayer in her language. The same words her grandmother had once said when someone's life was hanging in the balance. She wasn't a doctor, but she had learned to fight sickness with knowledge passed down from her people. She boiled more herbs in a small pot over the fire. The leaves released a sharp healing smell into the cool air. The night creatures stayed quiet around them, as if the forest itself knew a life was being fought for. She dipped the cloth into the warm liquid and gently cleaned the wound again. Ethan stirred, letting out a low sound, but didn't fully wake. His body was still weak, but she saw a faint sign of strength returning. Hours passed slowly. The stars moved across the sky and the moon climbed high. The woman didn't sleep. She stayed beside him, adding wood to the fire, wiping his forehead and making sure the bleeding had stopped completely. In the quiet of the night, she studied his face. The rough skin of a man who had lived through many hard days. The sharp lines of someone who carried heavy burdens. She didn't know his name, but something about him didn't feel like the dangerous men she had seen before. There was a tired honesty in his face, like a man who had been running from something too long. Still, she kept her knife within reach. Out here, trust was earned slowly. The wind shifted sometime before dawn. Ethan shivered and let out a soft groan. His eyelids fluttered, and slowly his eyes opened. The world was blurry at first, firelight flickering, the sound of flowing water, the smell of smoke and herbs. Then he saw her. She was sitting near the fire, her face calm, her long dark hair moving gently in the breeze. For a moment, Ethan thought he was dreaming. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his arm. She was beside him in seconds, steadying his shoulder with a firm hand. "Don't move," she said softly in her language. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. "Rest. Stay." He looked down at his arm and saw the careful bandage. The pain was dull but real. He realized she had saved him. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry. She reached behind her and brought a small cup made from wood. She lifted it to his lips and let him drink slowly. The water was cool and clean. Their eyes met properly for the first time. He whispered a raspy, "Thank you." She tilted her head slightly, not understanding, but she felt the weight of his gratitude. The morning sun began to touch the treetops, filling the canyon with a soft golden light. Birds started to sing, and the stream shimmered like glass. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was running. He felt safe. The Apache woman stood and moved to the stream, washing her hands in the blood-stained cloth. Ethan watched her silently. She moved with quiet confidence, like someone who belonged completely to the land around her. She didn't need words to express herself. Everything about her said strength and stillness. Ethan leaned his head back against the tree. He remembered the moment before he fell. The pain, the cold creeping through him, the certainty that this was the end. But she had found him. She had saved him when she had every reason not to. He wondered why. She returned to the fire and poured him a warm drink made from herbs. When she offered it, he hesitated for a moment. Then he took it. The drink was bitter, but it warmed his chest and made his heart beat stronger. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Their worlds were different. But something else began to build between them. Something quieter than words. A sense of shared space, a small thread of trust. As the day moved forward, she prepared food. She cooked a small portion of dried meat and roots wrapped in leaves. The smell made Ethan realize how hungry he was. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. When she handed him a small portion, he took it carefully. He didn't want to scare her. "Ethan," he whispered, tapping his chest lightly. "Ethan." She watched him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand. After a moment, she tapped her own chest. "Ayanna," she said softly. He repeated it, his voice rough. "Ayanna." For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips. It wasn't a full smile, but it softened her face. The simple exchange of names felt like a bridge being built between two very different lives. As the sun climbed higher, Ethan tried to move his arm. Pain shot through him, and Ayanna quickly stopped him with a firm hand. She shook her head, her dark eyes serious. She didn't need to say anything. He understood. Rest. She sat near the stream, braiding her hair and keeping an ear on every sound around them. The land could be dangerous, and helping a stranger could bring more trouble than safety. She had grown up hearing stories of conflict. But when she had seen him bleeding under the moonlight, she had followed her heart, not fear. Ethan spent most of the day gaining strength. He drank water, ate slowly, and rested. He watched the way she moved, silent, efficient, strong. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply herself. Ayanna checked the bandage again, pressing gently around the wound. Ethan winced, but he didn't pull away. Her touch was careful and skilled. She changed the herbs, added fresh poultice, and rewrapped it with clean deerskin. The sun began to lower again, painting the sky in warm colors. Ethan felt the ache in his body ease little by little. He still couldn't stand, but the fear of dying had left him. What remained was something unexpected. The feeling of being watched over. That night, Ayanna didn't light a big fire. She kept it small, enough to keep them warm but not to draw attention. She knew riders sometimes passed through this area. She didn't want anyone finding them. Ethan looked at her and quietly said, "Why?" He didn't expect her to understand, but his voice carried something soft, a quiet confusion mixed with gratitude. She didn't answer, just glanced at him with calm eyes and then turned her face back to the fire. She didn't help for reward. She helped because life had taught her to protect those in need. A wind passed through the canyon, and for a moment everything grew still. The stars came out again, bright and endless. Ethan lay back, staring at them. It had been years since he had looked at the sky like this, without worry, without hurry. Ayanna sat nearby, her knife resting on her lap. her senses alert even in the stillness. She had grown up learning to listen to the land, the rustle of leaves, the shift in the air, the distant steps of animals. Tonight everything was calm. Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know who she really was. But deep down a quiet thought settled inside him like a seed in the earth. He owed her his life. Ayanna glanced at him again. His face was no longer pale. His breathing was steady. She allowed herself a small breath of relief. She didn't know why she had chosen to save this stranger, but sometimes the land brings people together for reasons no one can explain. As the firelight flickered softly, Ethan whispered her name once more before sleep pulled him under. Ayanna. She didn't answer, but in the silence of the night something unspoken passed between them, a quiet bond that neither of them fully understood yet. She stayed awake long after he slept, watching the stars, listening to the night. She didn't know that the man resting beneath the tree had already made a silent promise in his heart. A promise he himself didn't fully understand. Not yet, but someday she would. And that promise would change both their lives forever. The next few days passed slowly, like gentle streams moving through quiet land. The sun rose and set, and with every passing hour Ethan grew a little stronger. His arm still ached, but the fever had gone and the bleeding had stopped. The air around the canyon felt alive. Birds sang in the morning, the wind danced through the trees, and the river's soft music filled the silence. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt peace. Every day followed a quiet rhythm. Ayanna would rise before dawn, light the small fire, and walk to the stream to collect water. Ethan would wake up to the sound of her footsteps, light and steady like a deer's. She never spoke much, but everything she did had meaning. When she handed him a cup of warm herbs in the morning, she didn't need to explain. He knew it was to help him heal. He tried to move more each day, pushing himself to sit up and stretch. The first time he managed to sit without help, she watched from a distance, arms folded, a faint spark of approval in her eyes. She didn't smile, not fully, but there was a warmth in her gaze that said she was proud of his strength. They had no common language, but they began to understand each other through small gestures. When she wanted him to drink, she tapped the cup. When he wanted to thank her, he touched his chest and nodded. She understood. When he wanted to know if she was safe, he pointed to the trees around them. She would glance at the forest with calm eyes, then nod once. Everything was quiet. Ethan often watched her when she didn't notice. She moved like part of the land, light on her feet, aware of every sound. Her hands were strong and steady, whether she was grinding herbs, fixing a net by the stream, or braiding her long dark hair. She wasn't afraid of the world. She belonged to it. One afternoon, Ethan tried to stand for the first time. The sun was high and the breeze was warm. He pushed himself up against the tree, his good hand pressing against the trunk. His legs shook, but he didn't stop. Ayanna saw him from across the stream. She walked over slowly, her steps careful, her eyes sharp. He stood for a few seconds, breathing heavily, then stumbled forward. Before he could fall, she caught his good arm. Her grip was strong, much stronger than he expected. For a brief moment, they stood close, his heart beating fast, her eyes steady and calm. Then she guided him gently back to the tree. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head at his own weakness. Ayanna didn't laugh, but she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, a gesture that said, "You're still alive. Keep going." Each day after that, he walked a few more steps. He followed the stream's edge, leaning on branches for support. Sometimes Ayanna followed quietly, keeping a distance but always watching. Other times she walked ahead of him, letting him find his strength but never letting him fall. Ethan didn't ask why she was helping him. She didn't ask where he came from. Their silence wasn't empty. It was a language of its own. Ayanna had saved many lives before, but this was different. This man had no one else. He wasn't part of her tribe, not part of her world, but somehow, she didn't feel the need to push him away. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky with red and gold, Ethan sat by the fire, his arm resting on his lap. Ayanna sat across from him, weaving a string of beads. The firelight flickered between them, warming the cool air. He watched her hands move, slow, steady, sure. He picked up a small stone and pointed at himself. "Ethan," he said softly. She glanced up. Her fingers paused for a second, then she tapped her chest. Ayanna. They had already exchanged names before, but this time it felt different. It wasn't a moment of survival anymore. It was a moment of connection, Ethan touched his injured arm and then pointed at her. He tried to form the words, "You saved me." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the look in his eyes. She lowered her head slightly as if embarrassed by the gratitude. She pointed to the sky, then to the river, then back to him. He realized she was saying something simple, that the land had brought their paths together. That this moment wasn't planned by either of them. It just was. Ethan leaned back against the tree, letting the night sounds fill the air. He felt something shift inside him, something quiet but strong. For years he had lived as a drifter, moving from one town to another, never belonging anywhere. But here, in this hidden canyon, he felt a stillness he didn't know he had been searching for. The days grew warmer. His arm healed faster than he expected. Soon he was able to help her with small things. He gathered dry wood for the fire, fetched water from the stream, and sometimes even helped her set traps for rabbits. She didn't ask him to do these things. He just did them because it felt right. Ayanna would glance at him with quiet eyes whenever he worked beside her. She wasn't used to strangers staying this long. Her world was small and careful, but slowly she began to trust his presence. She even gave him a small leather band to tie around his wrist, something her people used as a sign of safe passage. Ethan wore it without a word. He understood its meaning. One night, when the stars were bright and the moon cast a silver light on the canyon, Ethan sat beside the fire, staring at the flames. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to speak even if she wouldn't understand. "I don't deserve this," he said softly. "I've been many things in this life. Some good, some not, but you gave me a second chance without asking anything." Ayanna looked at him, not understanding the words but feeling the emotion behind them. She tilted her head slightly and then said something in her language, quiet and soft. The only word Ethan could catch was his name. He didn't know what she said, but it wrapped around him like a warm blanket. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger in the silence. She taught him how to make small herbal mixes for pain. He showed her how to tie knots he had learned on cattle drives. They learned to understand each other with their hands, their eyes, their silence. Sometimes, when Ayanna worked near the stream, Ethan would watch her, feeling something unfamiliar grow in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, quieter, something he didn't dare name. Ayanna, too, felt something shift. She had saved many lives before, but no one had stayed. No one had looked at her like he did, with quiet respect, not pity. One evening, a storm rolled across the sky. Rain poured down in thick sheets and thunder echoed through the canyon. They took shelter under the tree where Ethan had almost died weeks earlier. The fire hissed as the wind pushed against them. Ethan sat close to Ayanna, the rain dripping from his hat. For a long time they sat in silence, listening to the storm. Then, without thinking, Ethan whispered, "I'll never forget what you did for me." Ayanna didn't understand the words, but she saw the way his eyes held hers, and she understood that promise in the way the land understands rain. When the storm passed and the stars returned, Ethan knew something for sure. He didn't want to leave this place, not yet. Maybe not ever. Ayanna sat beside him, watching the last drops of rain fall from the leaves. She didn't know it yet, but the cowboy beside her had made a silent vow in his heart. A vow that one day, if the world ever came to harm her, he would stand between her and anything that threatened her. The bond between them had started with a wound and a kindness. But now it had grown into something neither of them could name, something stronger than words. Something lasting. The night breeze moved softly through the canyon and the stars burned bright above them. Neither spoke, but both felt it. A thread had been tied between their lives, quiet and unbreakable. And neither of them wanted it to end. The warm days of early summer settled gently over the canyon. The river ran clear. The wind smelled of pine and sun-baked earth, and the small camp beneath the tall tree became their shared home. Ethan's arm was no longer wrapped in bandages. It still carried a scar, but the pain had faded. He could move easily now, walk without stumbling, and work beside Ayanna as if he had always belonged to that quiet piece of land. He had stopped counting the days. Out here, time didn't feel like a line. It felt like a river that moved softly, carrying them both forward without hurry. Ayanna worked during the mornings, collecting herbs, drying meat, weaving baskets, and keeping the place ready for the changing season. Ethan helped without being asked, fetching water, repairing a broken fence of branches near the edge of the stream, and carrying wood. Their silence had grown comfortable, filled with meaning. But on one afternoon, the wind changed. Ethan noticed it first. He had grown used to the sounds of the canyon, the rustle of leaves, the birds, the soft crack of twigs under animals' feet. That day, everything went quiet. The birds stopped singing. The wind didn't dance through the trees the same way. It felt heavy, uneasy. Ayanna noticed it too. She stopped grinding herbs and slowly lifted her head, her dark eyes narrowing. She didn't say a word, but she picked up her knife and walked to the edge of the trees. Ethan followed, a steady unease growing inside him. From a small ridge, they saw a trail of dust rising in the distance, a sign of riders. They were heading toward the canyon. Ayanna's hand tightened around the handle of her knife. She didn't know who they were yet, but riders seldom came here for peaceful reasons. This part of the land was quiet, hidden, not a place people visited without purpose. Ethan's heart began to pound. He had hoped this part of his past would not follow him here, but he wasn't surprised. Trouble had a way of finding him. He glanced at her and she saw something in his eyes, a weight, an old shadow. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She simply understood that the peace they had built together was about to be tested. She moved quickly, gathering what she needed to protect the camp. Ethan grabbed the few things he had, a canteen, a small hatchet, and the strength that had returned to his body. The riders were still far, but the dust cloud grew larger with each passing minute. As they stood together under the tree, Ethan turned to her. "You should hide," he said softly. He knew she didn't understand the words, but his tone was clear. He didn't want her caught in whatever storm was coming. But Ayanna shook her head slowly, her eyes firm. She was not someone who turned away when danger approached. She stood her ground, the same way she had that night when she pulled the bullet from his arm. Ethan took a deep breath. The time he had spent here had changed him in ways he didn't expect. He wasn't the same man who had fallen near the river, weak and ready to give up. This place and this woman had given him something to live for. And now, for the first time in years, he felt a strong, clear purpose. To protect her. The sound of hooves grew louder. Through the thin line of trees, Ethan finally saw them. 3 riders, their horses kicking up dust as they drew near. He recognized the way they rode. He had seen it many times before. These were the kind of men who followed old scores, who hunted for what they wanted without care for who got hurt. Ayanna and Ethan moved to the side of the camp, where large rocks created natural cover. She crouched low, alert and silent. He stood just behind her, every sense awake. The riders slowed as they entered the canyon. Their eyes scanned the place. Ethan stayed hidden, his mind racing. He didn't want to bring violence to this quiet land. He wanted them to leave. But if they didn't, he knew what he had to do. One of the men dismounted and walked toward the stream. His boots crushed the soft earth. He looked around and spotted the fire pit. "Someone's been here," he muttered. Ethan could hear the tone of his voice, how sharp, searching. Ayanna placed a hand lightly on Ethan's arm, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a small nod. He wasn't running. Not this time. When the riders came closer, Ethan stepped out from behind the rocks. It wasn't a grand moment. It was quiet, steady, like a man who had already made up his mind. The men stopped, surprised. They hadn't expected him to show himself. "Didn't think you'd still be breathing," one of them said with a dry laugh. Ethan didn't reply. He didn't look afraid either. Behind him, hidden but close, Ayanna stood ready. The men looked around. "You alone?" the leader asked. His eyes narrowed. He didn't see Ayanna, but his tone carried a threat. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than words. The leader stepped forward. "You know why we're here. You don't walk away from what you owe." Ethan didn't move. In that moment, something inside him shifted again. A few months ago, he might have run, but now he couldn't. He thought of Ayanna pulling the bullet from his arm, of her sitting through cold nights to keep him alive, of her quiet strength. He thought of the canyon, the river, the soft mornings they had shared in silence. This wasn't just his fight anymore. This was their home. Before the rider could take another step, Ayanna stepped out from behind the rocks. The men stiffened at the sight of her. She held her knife with calm hands. Her presence wasn't loud or wild, but strong, like a storm that doesn't need thunder to be feared. The leader's eyes flicked between Ethan and Ayanna. He smirked, thinking she was just someone standing in the way. But Ethan took a step closer to her, standing between her and the men. That one small movement spoke louder than any speech. The canyon fell quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Leave," Ethan said softly. The leader laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. Or what? Ethan didn't raise his voice. Or you won't walk out. The three riders glanced at each other. They had seen men make empty threats before, but something about Ethan, the way he stood, the steady fire in his eyes, made them pause. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't the same man they had once hunted. Behind him, Ayanna didn't flinch. She stayed still, silent, like part of the land itself. The leader shifted uneasily. The canyon wasn't their place. It was quiet and watchful, like it didn't welcome them. After a long, tense silence, the man spat to the side and pulled the reins of his horse. "This ain't over," he said. But he turned his horse around. One by one, they rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. The wind slowly returned. The birds began to sing again. Ethan let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ayanna lowered her knife. For a moment, they just stood there, listening to the world settle back into its rhythm. Then Ethan turned to her. Her face was calm, but her eyes held something deep. Not fear, not even surprise. It was trust. She hadn't doubted him, not once. He whispered, almost to himself, "I won't let anyone hurt you." She didn't understand the words, but she understood everything else. She saw it in his eyes. That night, the fire burned brighter than usual. The air was cool, and the stars were clear. Ayanna sat by the stream, her reflection dancing on the water. Ethan stood a few steps away, looking at the horizon where the riders had disappeared. He knew they might come back. He also knew he wouldn't run if they did. She looked over her shoulder at him. He walked toward her slowly, as if not to disturb the quiet. They sat beside the stream together. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In the flickering light of the fire, Ethan looked at her and felt the truth settle deep in his chest. She had saved him once, and now he had promised himself, silently, firmly, that he would stand for her no matter what. Not out of debt, but out of something much stronger. The night air wrapped around them, soft and still. The river whispered below. The stars burned bright above. And in that quiet moment, two lives from two very different worlds were tied together by a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. But both had already made. The canyon was peaceful again. The riders had left, and the wind carried only the soft rustle of trees and the river's quiet song. The days after that tense evening moved slowly, gently, like a stream after a storm. Ethan felt something inside him change, not suddenly, but deeply, like the earth shifting beneath quiet ground. He had always been a man who kept moving, never staying long in one place, never letting his heart get tied to anything. But now, every time the sun rose over the canyon, he felt a little less like a man passing through and a little more like someone who belonged. He began to rise before dawn, just as Ayanna did. She no longer had to tell him what to do. He fetched water, cut wood, mended what needed mending, and shared the quiet work of the day with her. Their silence was never heavy. It felt warm, like two people who no longer needed to fill the air with words. She would glance at him sometimes just to make sure he was there, and every time he was. One cool morning, Ethan followed her to the stream. The water was clear and cold, reflecting the first light of day. Ayanna knelt to collect herbs, her hands moving gently through the plants as if they were part of her. Ethan stood behind her, watching in silence. He admired the way she belonged to this place, not like someone who claimed the land, but like someone who listened to it. He knelt beside her and helped her pick the leaves. She didn't ask him to, but she didn't stop him either. She just gave him a small, quiet look that said more than words ever could. They worked together until the sun touched the tops of the trees, painting everything in gold. As they walked back to camp, a thought lingered in Ethan's heart. Ayanna didn't know it, but that night when the riders came, something had settled in him. He had made a silent promise, not one born from duty, but from something far deeper. He would stay by her side. He would protect her, not because he owed her his life, but because she had become a part of his. Ayanna noticed a change in him too. He no longer looked like a man ready to leave at the first sign of trouble. His shoulders were steadier. His eyes no longer carried the same wandering look they had when she found him half dead by the stream. She didn't fully understand why he had chosen to stay, but she felt his presence like the steady warmth of the sun. One evening, when the sky burned with soft orange light, they sat near the fire after finishing their work. Ayanna wove a small bracelet from dried grass and soft strands of leather. Ethan watched her hands move, gentle and sure. After a while, she stood and walked toward him. Without saying anything, she tied the bracelet around his wrist. Ethan looked at her, surprised. She met his eyes calmly and spoke softly in her language. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The gesture itself said everything. She was trusting him, welcoming him into her world in a way she hadn't before. He placed his hand over the bracelet and whispered her name. Ayanna. She didn't reply, but the faintest smile touched her lips before she returned to her seat by the fire. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay under the stars, staring at the endless sky, listening to the river. His old life felt far away, like a trail he had once walked but no longer wanted to return to. For the first time, he felt still. He thought about the woman who had saved him without knowing who he was, who had stayed by his side without asking for anything. She had no idea how deeply that had changed him. The next morning, Ethan began to build something new near the tall tree, a simple shelter made of branches, wood, and leather. He worked with quiet hands, measuring every step carefully. Ayanna watched him from a distance at first. She didn't interrupt, just stood near the stream with a curious expression. When he was halfway through, she walked over and picked up a few branches. Without a word, she began to help him. Side by side, they built a small but strong shelter. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep out the rain and wind. Every movement they shared made the bond between them stronger, like roots growing quietly beneath the earth. That evening, when the shelter stood finished, Ethan stepped back and looked at it with quiet pride. Ayanna touched the wooden frame, nodding softly. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a sign. He wasn't leaving. Weeks passed, and their small world grew fuller. Ethan learned to understand more of Ayanna's gestures, and she learned a few of his words. He taught her how to tie new kinds of knots and fix leather straps. She taught him how to read the forest, which plants were safe, which birds warned of danger, which wines brought rain. Sometimes at night, they would sit together near the stream, not speaking at all, just listening to the sounds around them. It was the kind of silence that was full, not empty. Ethan often looked at her then, the firelight touching her face, and thought about how strange it was that two people from such different worlds could find a home in each other's company. But Ayanna knew the world outside the canyon wasn't kind. She had grown up hearing stories of broken promises, of people who came and then left. She watched Ethan carefully, not out of fear, but out of quiet caution. She had learned long ago that trust was like a delicate seed. It could grow strong, but it needed care. Ethan saw this in her eyes, and he respected it. He didn't try to rush her trust. Instead, he simply stayed. Every sunrise, every small task, every quiet night, he was there. And slowly, Ayanna's guarded heart began to accept what her eyes already knew. He wasn't going anywhere. One night, when the moon was high and the river shimmered silver, Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "I made a promise," he said. "I'll keep it." Ayanna didn't understand the words, but she felt the weight in his voice. She looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then she nodded slowly, not because she understood the language, but because she understood him. The season began to change. The wind grew cooler and the trees whispered different songs. The canyon no longer felt like just a hiding place. It felt like home. Ethan often rode out in the early morning to gather supplies from far-off places, but he always returned before the stars appeared. And every time he came back, Ayanna was waiting by the stream as steady as the river itself. People in nearby towns started to whisper. They spoke of a cowboy who had once disappeared and of a quiet Apache woman who had saved him. Some said he guarded her canyon now. Some said he had vanished into the wild. Ethan didn't care what they said. The only truth that mattered was here, beside her. One quiet evening, Ayanna sat by the stream, braiding her hair as she always did. Ethan walked over and sat next to her. The river reflected the fading light of day. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the riverbank. He pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "For you," he said softly. She looked at the stone, then at him. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the warmth in them. She held the stone to her chest and nodded. The wind blew softly through the trees. The stars began to rise one by one like lanterns in the sky. Ethan sat beside her, watching the night settle in. He didn't need a map anymore. He didn't need a road to follow. His road ended here in this canyon, with the woman who had once pulled a bullet from his arm and unknowingly tied their lives together. Ayana leaned back slightly, not close enough to break the quiet balance between them, but close enough that Ethan felt it, the quiet trust, the shared air, the bond that no one had forced, only built slowly like a river carving its way through stone. He looked at her, his voice low but firm. "I'll always protect you." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the look in his eyes, the weight in his voice, the calm promise that wrapped around the night like a warm blanket. She nodded, a quiet answer to a promise she could feel in her bones. The fire cracked softly. The river sang its endless song. The stars above watched silently as two souls, a wandering cowboy and an Apache woman, sat together by the stream, no longer strangers, no longer alone. Their story had begun with pain and chance, but it had grown into something strong, quiet and unbreakable. A bond forged not with words but with trust, courage, and a promise made beneath the stars.